during Iraq. A leftist group accused Moselle of being a CIA agent. The U.S. Embassy says he was an accountant for a private company. He had retired from the Air Force after 20 years.
If their aim had been better, the
opening. Concussion from the exploding
is now well into its fourth week. Action from the Iraqi side is, for the time being at least, nothing more than symbolic. Another Scud missile arched over Riyadh in Saudi Arabia this evening, but before it could explode on the ground, it was apparently intercepted by 2 Patriot missiles. Large pieces of debris fell onto the empty parking lot of a driving school, but no one was hurt. Meanwhile, the air war against Iraqi troop emplacements in occupied Kuwait continued relentlessly. Defense Secretary Cheney and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Colin Powell, are on their way to the Gulf to assess whether, and if so when, the ground war should begin. The commander of British forces in the Gulf said today that a ground war is inevitable. French President Mitterrand predicted that it will begin before the end of the month. What you're about to hear, however, has little to do with the overview of war or the upcoming campaign. It is a small profile, a tiny slice of the war as seen from the Iraqi trenches. And perhaps most appropriately, we're going to hear about it from a reporter for Life Magazine Weekly. For some of us, our weekly edition of Life Magazine was also our first close-up look at war. Well, in a few days, Life is about to start publishing weekly again. One of its reporters, Edward Barnes, struck out on his own without benefit of military escort, but together with a Life photographer and also with another reporter-photographer team for the British newspaper, The Independent. Ed Barnes joins us by telephone from a town we've been asked not to identify near the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. We are also joined from Dhahran by photojournalist Isabelle Elson, who writes for the French newspaper Le Journal du Dimanche, and who is a photographer for The Independent. Isabelle, you went out on your own, what, by jeep?
Yes, by a four-wheel drive.
And how long were you gone?
Sorry?
How long were you gone? How many days?
2 days. We slept with in the desert with the Kuwaiti army, and it happened the day after, very early in the morning.
And when you say it happened, what happened?
Well, we were on our way back to Afar al-Batin, and we were driving on the road when we saw those 4 guys in a very tired uniform, khaki uniform. And well, first we didn't think it was Iraqis because there are so many different people in this area, so many different armies. And somebody in the car, I can't remember who it is, said there might be Iraqis. So we thought for a few seconds we should maybe just pretend that we didn't see them. And well, we finally drove to them and stopped the car. And Edward Barnes got out the car and asked Iraqis, and they said yes. Americans, we said yes. And we got them into the car.
Ed Barnes, pick up the story for me, if you will, and let me just throw a question at you, partially out of jealousy. I wish I had the story, but if you come right down to it, a pretty dumb thing to do. I mean, here are 4 armed Iraqis. You guys are all unarmed. You stop, get out of the car, and ask them who they are and what they're doing there?
Yeah, well, it's just even dumber, Ted. They said they were Iraqis, and I had never been a captor before, and I don't think they had ever been prisoners. So we were both learning whole new roles standing there by the side of the road, and neither of us were quite sure what to do. We sort of got out, used what little Arabic we had, shook hands with him, and stood there staring at him. And they stared at us, waiting for somebody to figure out what to do next. Finally, we got them into the back seat of the Land Rover, 4 of them together, and we started to huddle in when we remembered we were journalists. So we screamed, "Get out of the car!" We didn't take a picture. So they bewildered, they got back out of the car, stood by the road, and we did our journalistic duties and took their pictures and trundled them back into the car again.
Now, I must say, Ed, I've heard versions of the story that have been passed on to me, and what I must say strikes me as most remarkable of all is apparently you never disarmed them. I mean, they still had their AK-47s, right?
That's right, and hand grenades and lots of ammunition, and at one point we even gave them our lone pocket knife. So, yeah, there was never any sense of threat, though. When we first pulled up on them, they were the Allies dropped small white leaflets on explaining how to surrender. And what you're supposed to do is put your rifle over your left shoulder, point the muzzle down, and hold this piece of paper over your head. So when we pulled up, two of them were actually holding the surrender papers. So we're pretty confident that they were not. There was not an ambush.
Actually, we are looking now, Ed, sorry to interrupt you. We're looking because we have one of those pamphlets and we have one of those pictures, so we're showing it to our viewers right now. Did any of you, in fact, even remember that those leaflets had been dropped, and was it immediately clear to you that they were trying to surrender?
Absolutely. Once those leaflets went up, it was easy. Yeah, we knew what they were doing. The one thing, the thought that came to the mind, apparently there had been two incidents where Iraqis had pretended to surrender and then had not done it. And later on in an interview with them, through a Saudi officer, we asked what they thought when we pulled up. And they had a small huddle, and because our Jeep looked a bit like an Iraqi patrol vehicle, they had discussed machine gunning us.
Let me, before we go on with the story, go to Isabel and just ask you, Isabel, for simply a personal description of how these men look to you. And we're going to look at some of your photographs a little bit later on. But right now, I would just like your impressions of how these men appeared to you. How did they look?
Well, they looked very tired, and they said one of their first words was food. They were saying that there were no food in the troops, but they didn't look skinny or, in a very bad shape. But as soon as they got in the car, we gave them some food, and it took them quite a while to dare taking the food. Their uniform were in a very bad shape, very tired uniform, and as well for the guns. I mean, it's not a very good equipment, or it doesn't look a very modern equipment. They said they've been walking for about 12 hours, and they were pretty tired, but they're certainly very tough people because they don't eat, they have no water, they didn't have a shower for 4 months, and they were still in a pretty good shape. I mean, well, comparing to other people.
All right,
yes.
we'll pick up with the story of how you finally got them into Saudi hands, and also by telephone with Life magazine reporter Edward Barnes near the Kuwaiti border, and in Dhahran, Isabel Elson, a photographer for the London newspaper The Independent. So there you were, Ed Barnes, in this Jeep with 4 armed Iraqi soldiers in the back, and you've been nice enough to give them food and a knife, and you're driving through the desert. Where? Do you know where you're going?
Yeah, well, right now we've become journalists again, and we know that, and there are prisoners. They're not POWs, they're prisoners of the press, and they're not going to get away without an interview. So what we need to find is a translator at this point. And there was an Allied commando camp somewhere about 70 kilometers away, where I knew some Egyptian officers, and there was a Saudi officer who spoke English and would probably help us out. The dilemma with that is it's through 3 or 4 sectors in the desert of other Allied troops. So what we had to do then was take the Land Rover and go through basically 3 or 4 armies to try and get to someone who could translate for us.
Now, was any of those armies, by coincidence, the U.S. Army, and was there any particular reason why you weren't taking them to U.S. troops?
They didn't. Well, one thing, they didn't want to be delivered to U.S. troops. They felt comfortable with the Saudis. I think that it was they wanted to be delivered to. Later on in the interview, they said Muslim brothers or people of God, and that they didn't think the Americans fit that description. So what we did was we took off and tried to. We had to go through a couple of sentry points, and I was driving, so that I would speed the Jeep up, sort of wave to the sentry and try and get away before he noticed there were 4 heavily armed Iraqis that had just gone through his checkpoint. And we had to do this about 4 times. And finally, we got to the camp, and I parked about 500 meters from the camp, and ran in hoping to find the colonel who I knew there, only to find the Egyptian troops in full formation, and they had just replaced the company I knew. So I immediately ran out of camp and tried to find the Saudi officer who agreed to, after hasty negotiations, to translate. Meanwhile, Richard, Tony O'Brien, the photographer for life, and Isabel were back at the car, and the Egyptian guards were getting suspicious of this car parked outside their perimeter and starting to walk over.
Well, let me have Isabel pick up the story at this point. Then, Isabel, so you had been sitting in the car while Ed was in trying to find the Saudi officer, and what's going on in the back of the Jeep meanwhile, and what's happening with the Egyptian guards?
Well, at the back of the Jeep, we were just concerned. No, we forgot to disarm those guys, so they still had their AK-47 and grenades and everything. And we were trying to keep them occupied, you know, like have something to eat, have a cigarette, and talking to them. And they were not scared, but not very comfortable. So we were trying to explain to them very slowly in English that, you know, everything was fine, they would be well treated and that sort of thing. And we've been waiting like, I don't know, I would say 10, 15 minutes for Ed to come back. And, you know, it was Tony O'Brien was on the back of the Jeep and looking after the guys, and Richard and myself were on the front, and we were just waiting for Ed to, you know, give us a sign to tell us if it was okay.
All right, and so finally, Ed, you and your Saudi officer friend came back, and was he a little bit surprised or concerned by the fact that you had left their weapons with them?
He was stunned, yeah. As we walked back to the car, he casually asked, do they still have their weapons? Did you take their weapons? And I said, no. He said, they still have their weapons? And yes. And he asked if they had ammunition, and I said yes. And he asked if they had grenades, and I said yes. I didn't tell him about the knife. He sort of shuddered and put a couple of bullets around in his chamber and started to call for reinforcements. So with that sort of chaos, the Egyptians start to come out of the camp. He gets to the door, disarms them before he takes them out, and now they're basically in official custody.
Now, let's get a little bit to the side that I'm sure interests a great many Americans right now, and that is, eventually you were able, through an interpreter then, to get some information from these men. What did they say life in the trenches had been like?
Horrible. There's 24, they've been hit. They're from the 36th Iraqi Infantry Division, and they've been under basically 24-hour air attack for the last, since the 16th. They were tired. There was no food. They had been confined to they came over as four because it's a four-man unit, and they were put in a trench that was 3 meters long by 2 meters by 2 meters deep, and mines were sown in a complete circle around the trench so that they could neither go forward or get out. And there was a small pathway to the north where food would be brought in. At 4 o'clock every day, they would get 5 spoonfuls of rice on 1 piece of bread. There wasn't much water to go around. They had a small radio to try and keep up with what was going on, but the batteries had run dead, and they're too expensive or non-existent on the lines there. They were hungry, tired, dirty. The first words they said when they got in the car as we were driving was, "Saddam finished, Iraq finished." And later we asked them what would happen if when the ground attack came, and they said their entire division would surrender. All the men in their trenches were trying to figure out some way to surrender, but because of units in the Iraqi army that shoot people who try to go across, and minefields strewn both in front of and behind their own trenches so that they can neither go forward nor retreat, the other soldiers were just too afraid to come out and do it, and were basically waiting for the Allies to surrender to.
All right, Ed, we've got to take another break. Life reporter Ed Barnes and photojournalist Isabel Elson. Isabel, what did these men have to say about the bombing?
About the bomb?
Yes.
They said that it was like the end of the world. They said that The B-52s were absolutely terrible. They didn't know exactly what was going on. In fact, the only information they could get was through BBC radio. But they said, you know, the sound of those planes, and they didn't know exactly what it was, either, you know, F-15 or B-52s, but it was just absolutely terrible, and they couldn't stand it anymore.
Did they talk at all about casualties?
We asked them, and they didn't know. I don't think they have really good ways of communications between them, so they didn't know what was going on except in their units, and I think you should ask Ed, because he did the interview. I didn't hear anything about the casualties.
Ed, what about communication within the unit? Did they have any sense of what the casualties were in their own unit?
No, they didn't even know. I mean, in terms of they didn't even know what the casualties were in their own company. They were pretty well isolated in the four-man trench that they were relegated to, and they were afraid of communicating too much with other soldiers because in the other trenches somewhere was going to be a Republican Guard unit who they were afraid might find out their plans to defect.
How did
So
they?
didn't know.
I mean, what did they consider their mission to be? Obviously, someone had told them what they were just going to be sitting in that enlarged foxhole month after month, waiting for the Americans and the Allies to come, or did
Yeah,
they have any
they
sense
had-
of what their mission was?
No. And I asked, all of them had served 8 years in the Iran-Iraq War, and I asked them what the difference was between this war and that war. And they said, you know, the Iran-Iraq War made sense. They were fighting a real enemy there. And here, Kuwait wasn't the enemy, and they're not sure why they were there. Saddam said that Kuwait should be part of Iraq, but they didn't particularly believe it. It was just that there was nothing they could do about it.
They must have been terrified at the thought of defecting, because obviously the Iraqi army does not take kindly to the notion of defectors. Actually, no army does, but the Iraqis probably deal with it a little more precisely and immediately than most armies.
And viciously. One of the reasons they had their guns when they come over, or the American leaflets say, keep your gun over your left shoulder. Ordinarily, surrendering soldiers are supposed to throw their weapons away and come unarmed. But they carry the weapons all the way until they're actually in the hands of an Allied soldier or reporter, because they know that if their own men come after them, they're already dead men and they have to fight their way out.
Now, we're looking at some photographs that I guess Isabel took. They are not wearing helmets. Did they have helmets?
They had helmets and they had gas masks, and they threw them away on the way over or to travel faster.
Now, let me just talk to the two of you a little bit before we close the program out about why you went where you went in the manner that you went there. I mean, Ed, you must have realized that the risks you were taking were fairly considerable.
Well, yeah, that section of the border there's been some activity on, although in order to reach the troops to tell the stories that Life magazine has to do about what it's like to live in the trenches and on the front lines, it's the only way to do it. The military has been absolutely uncooperative in dealing with soldiers' lives and stuff like that, and it left only one alternative, which was to go out on your own and find the troops where they were in place and try and deal with them there.
Did, Isabel, did anyone ask these troops whether they had heard about the CBS crew that also tried to do the same thing and that has been gone now for weeks, has disappeared?
Yes, of course we did. And those guys said that they've been staying for 4 months in the area, but they didn't know anything about the CBS crew. We insisted on that question, but they couldn't answer. They didn't know what we were talking about.
Let me ask you the same question I asked Ed. Why take the risk that you took? Why not simply go out on one of the pools with all the other reporters?
Well, we don't have much choice. I think if we want to do some good stories, we have to get out from the pool. The pool doesn't take the journalists in the right places. I mean, not always. And the pool shows you what they want to show you. If you want to do something else, you have to do it on your own.
Ed, a final question or two about the 4 Iraqis. What ultimately happened to them?
They're sent back to an area, and they were given food and clothing, and apparently they're being treated fairly well. I've made contact with someone who has actually seen them in the last couple of hours, and said they're doing fine. Incidentally, they in the interview with them, they had all signed. They've been draftees on a 3-year hitch in the Iraqi army. One of them, that happened 11 years ago, two of them 6 years ago, one 7. So when they came over, and they basically had it with Army life.
All right. Well, listen, you're both terrific reporters. You're lousy guards, but we're glad you're safe, and thank you for coming on and telling us our story. Your story, rather. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Ana Chavez.
And I'm Richard Brown. Coalition commanders ordered hundreds of air sorties against new Iraqi targets today, and for the first time, Marines probed into Kuwait with the support of shells fired from a battleship off the coast. In Israel, at least one Scud missile tested the Israeli resolve Saturday morning, striking several buildings, injuring at least 17 people. The attack came at 2:40 a.m. Tel Aviv time and was the first in Israel since last Sunday. Residents reported hearing 3 explosions, but it wasn't clear whether they were more from one Scud or from the firing of Patriot anti-missile batteries. Damage on the ground included shattered walls and roofs of at least 4 large buildings and severed electrical and telephone lines. Local hospitals reported receiving 7 people with injuries, 10 people suffering anxiety attacks.
This will be a weekend full of meetings and morale boosting in Saudi Arabia as the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs continue their tour for President Bush. Today in the Saudi capital, they met with the commander of Gulf Operations, General Norman Schwarzkopf. They also met with the exiled Emir of Kuwait and stirred the passions of a few hundred Allied soldiers.
And now the focus of the battle will shift to the Iraqi army in Kuwait, which is what we came here to do, kick them out. We tried to give them some good advice a few months ago. We told them, move it or lose it. They wouldn't move it, and now they're going to lose it.
Secretary of Defense Cheney told the troops that they were the heart and soul of the most successful air campaign in the history of the world. Neither Cheney nor Powell said anything definitive about the likelihood of a ground war beginning soon. But Cheney did say that the decision is how and when to add to the already successful air campaign.
Among the many factors figured in when talking about the start of a ground war is the position of the moon. Allied forces launched the first aerial attack on a moonless night 3 weeks ago to take advantage of night vision technology. That same near-total darkness returns next Thursday and would, in theory, give an equal advantage to ground forces. Amphibious forces prefer high tides to reduce exposure to gunfire on the beaches. 6 days of high tides begin 1 week from tomorrow.
Tonight, the very organization that endorsed war against Iraq is asking for humanitarian aid to help Iraqi citizens, especially children. The General Secretary of the United Nations is warning that the number of civilian casualties in Iraq is growing, but he did not comment on the Iraqi claim that 4,000 children have died for lack of medicine and food. However, the United Nations Children's Fund is sending a convoy carrying $500,000 worth of emergency supplies, and the director of that fund is asking for a pause in the bombing so that the trucks can roll from Iran to Iraq. And the United Nations is being asked to send a task force to inspect war damage. Iraq is still claiming that Allied forces bombed that country's only baby formula factory. Today, top brass at the Pentagon said the building was definitely a biological weapons factory, and they implied that the Iraqis may have tried to deceive the world by setting up evidence at the scene.
There are mixed signals about the Gulf War coming from Jordan tonight, 2 days after a blistering speech by King Hussein. On Wednesday, the king accused Allied forces of plotting to carve up Middle Eastern territory to control their resources. One Jordanian official reportedly said his country may break relations with the United States. But tonight, an aide to King Hussein called that report a disinformation campaign. In Washington today, a State Department spokesperson confirmed reports